World War II was a conflict defined not only by the sheer scale of human tragedy, but by the innovations in technology and tactics that determined who would dominate the skies. While historians often focus on the titanic struggles of armies and navies, the air war above Europe was equally decisive, shaping the course of history in ways that few civilians of the era could have imagined. Among the most dramatic and surprising chapters of this aerial conflict was the rise of the American P-51 Mustang, a fighter aircraft that would redefine air superiority and crush the Luftwaffe in ways the Germans never anticipated. When the P-51 Mustang entered the European theater, it was not just another plane, it represented a seismic shift in the balance of power. And yet, its story is often overshadowed by the sheer scale of the war, buried beneath the larger narratives of battles on land and sea. To truly understand why the Germans were unprepared for the Mustang, we must examine not only the aircraft itself but the strategic context, the technological evolution, and the human drama that unfolded behind the cockpit. The Luftwaffe had long enjoyed dominance over Europe. Early in the war, Germany's air force seemed unstoppable. From the blitzkrieg campaigns that tore through Poland and France to the desperate defense of the Reich during the Battle of Britain, German pilots and their machines were the measuring stick against which all others were compared. Fighters like the Messerschmitt Bf 109 and the Focke-Wulf 190 were marvels of engineering in their own right, fast, maneuverable, and deadly in the hands of skilled pilots. By 1943, the Luftwaffe was still a formidable force, though cracks were beginning to show. Resources were stretched thin across multiple fronts, pilot training had declined in quality, and strategic bombing campaigns by the Allies were putting relentless pressure on German industry. Yet despite these strains, the Luftwaffe still believed it could counter any new threats, especially those from the Americans, whom they considered technologically capable but operationally less cunning in combat. This confidence would prove catastrophic when they encountered the P-51 Mustang. Unlike any American fighter that had come before it, the Mustang combined speed, range, firepower, and agility in a package that fundamentally disrupted the Luftwaffe's assumptions. At first glance, the Mustang might have seemed just another aircraft among the Allies' growing arsenal. But a closer look revealed its unique capabilities. Powered by the Rolls-Royce Merlin engine, the P-51 could escort bombers deep into German territory, something that earlier fighters, like the P-38 Lightning and the P-47 Thunderbolt, struggled to accomplish due to limited range. The ability to provide continuous fighter cover transformed strategic bombing from a risky gamble into a sustained, highly effective campaign. German pilots who had grown accustomed to striking vulnerable bombers without resistance suddenly found themselves facing Mustang formations, armed with advanced optics, superior speed, and unparalleled maneuverability at high altitudes. The shift was dramatic, and it came faster than anyone in the Luftwaffe expected. The Mustang's introduction wasn't just a technological surprise, it was a psychological one. For years, Luftwaffe pilots had enjoyed near total control over the skies, their tactics refined and their confidence unwavering. The P-51 shattered that illusion. Imagine a seasoned German ace, confident in his ability to down Allied bombers and fighters alike, suddenly encountering a machine that could outpace, outmaneuver, and outgun him at critical moments. The psychological impact was profound, contributing to declining morale and a reassessment of tactics that Germany could ill afford to make in the middle of a war it was already losing on multiple fronts. And yet, the story of the Mustang is not merely one of technical superiority. It is also one of American ingenuity, foresight, and the ability to adapt lessons learned in other theaters of war to solve an urgent problem. Engineers, pilots, and military planners collaborated in a way that turned theory into practice at an unprecedented speed. Contrast is key here. The Luftwaffe had relied on short-range fighters for quick, aggressive strikes. The Americans, learning from bitter experiences over Europe, realized that long-range escorts were essential to protect bombers on deep, penetration raids. The P-51 was the embodiment of this strategic pivot. It was not simply a plane designed to dogfight in isolated skirmishes. It was a tool of operational strategy, capable of extending American influence across the continent and ensuring that bombing campaigns could be conducted with devastating efficiency. This distinction between tactical and strategic air power was one that the Germans had underestimated, and it would prove fatal. When the Mustang began to dominate the skies, the Luftwaffe faced not just losses in aircraft, but a crippling erosion of the very doctrine upon which their air superiority had been built. Every encounter with a Mustang forced pilots and commanders to rethink formations, attack patterns, and defensive strategies, often in the middle of combat. The learning curve was steep, and for a military already strained by attrition, the pace was unbearable. The Mustang's performance in combat became legendary precisely because it was unexpected. Unlike the Bf-109, which had dominated early air battles through sheer maneuverability, or the F-190 with its rugged design and heavy armament, the P-51 combined multiple qualities in a single, elegant platform. Its high-speed performance at altitude allowed it to intercept German fighters before they could reach bombers. Its range allowed American bombers to be escorted on missions that were previously too dangerous, and its firepower, 6 .50 caliber M2 Browning machine guns, gave it the ability to inflict significant damage quickly without prolonged engagements that exposed pilots to unnecessary risk. The Mustang was more than a sum of its parts. It represented a doctrinal leap, enabling the Allies to execute strategies that had once seemed impossible. German pilots could no longer assume air superiority based on past performance or reputation. Every sortie became a test of skill against an opponent they were not prepared for, both technically and psychologically. Furthermore, the Mustang was a testament to iterative design and battlefield adaptation. Initially, American fighters like the P-40 Warhawk and the P-38 Lightning had limitations that prevented them from fully supporting deep bombing missions. Designers and engineers did not simply accept these limitations. They innovated. The integration of the Merlin engine, for instance, was not an arbitrary upgrade. It addressed a very specific need: high-altitude performance, where Luftwaffe fighters excelled. Every design choice reflected a sophisticated understanding of the operational environment and the weaknesses of the opponent. Contrast this with German engineering, which, while brilliant in certain areas, was often constrained by resource shortages and strategic miscalculations. The Mustang's success was not just technical, it was a combination of ingenuity, strategy, and timing, catching the Germans off guard in a war where such advantages were rare and decisive. By the time the Luftwaffe realized the full impact of the P-51 Mustang, it was too late. Losses mounted, pilot experience declined, and the psychological edge the Germans had maintained for years evaporated. The Mustang did not merely survive encounters with German fighters, it dominated them, often in ways that redefined what was possible in aerial combat. The Germans had never anticipated an aircraft that could combine range, speed, maneuverability, and firepower so effectively. And in doing so, the Mustang became a symbol of Allied innovation, determination, and the relentless push to turn the tide of war. Its introduction marks a pivotal moment in World War II aviation history, demonstrating how technology, strategy, and human courage intersect to produce outcomes that change the course of conflict. As the Mustang began its campaign across the skies of Europe, the scale of its impact became increasingly apparent. American bombers, once vulnerable to concentrated attacks by Luftwaffe fighters, were now shielded by long-range P-51 escorts. This shift forced the Germans into a defensive posture they were not accustomed to maintaining. The Luftwaffe's tactics, honed over years of rapid strikes and aggressive engagements, suddenly seemed inadequate. Pilots who had relied on numerical superiority, coordinated formations, and high-speed dives found themselves struggling to adapt. The Mustang was faster at high altitudes, more agile than many of its adversaries, and equipped with firepower that could break apart formations in moments. The psychological pressure on German pilots was immense. Every encounter risked not just their aircraft, but their lives in a war where replacements for skilled pilots were becoming increasingly scarce. In essence, the P-51 Mustang did not just challenge the Luftwaffe, it systematically dismantled the assumptions that had underpinned Germany's aerial dominance. The strategic implications were equally profound. Before the arrival of the Mustang, bombing raids over Germany were fraught with danger. Allied commanders understood that without fighter escorts capable of reaching deep into enemy territory, losses would be catastrophic. Bombers were forced to fly in tight formations to maximize defensive firepower, making them predictable and vulnerable. The Luftwaffe exploited this, sending wave after wave of fighters to intercept and destroy bomber formations. Cities, factories, and supply lines were within reach of American bombers, but the threat of devastating losses often limited operational effectiveness. The Mustang changed all of this. Suddenly, bombers could venture deep into German territory with unprecedented protection. Their survival rates soared, operational reach expanded, and the Allies could execute more aggressive campaigns against industrial centers. It was not merely an advantage in combat. It was a strategic revolution in the air war. This strategic revolution became visible in specific campaigns. Consider the bombing of Berlin and other major German industrial centers in late 1943 and 1944. Before the Mustang's introduction, these raids incurred devastating losses, sometimes with dozens of bombers shot down in a single mission. The psychological toll on bomber crews was immense, and the impact on German morale was significant. When the Mustang arrived, the game changed. Luftwaffe pilots who had once expected easy victories were now met with aircraft that could engage them on equal terms, or superior terms, depending on altitude, speed, and positioning. Entire defensive strategies had to be reevaluated, and the German high command struggled to respond effectively. For the Allies, this was a moment of calculated advantage. Not only were bomber crews more confident, but the Luftwaffe's attrition began to accelerate. The P-51 did not merely protect bombers, it actively eroded the enemy's capability to resist, striking at the heart of Germany's air defense network. The Mustang's superiority was not merely a factor of technology, it was also a product of training, doctrine, and tactical innovation. American pilots were rigorously trained to maximize the aircraft's strengths. Unlike some German squadrons, which were increasingly relying on raw experience due to pilot shortages, American units emphasized teamwork, coordinated attacks, and leveraging the Mustang's speed and range. This focus amplified the plane's effectiveness in combat. Pilots learned to use the Mustang's ability to climb quickly, dive at high speed, and engage multiple targets with precision. German pilots, by contrast, often found themselves in a reactive stance, forced to respond to maneuvers they had not anticipated. The contrast between American innovation and German adaptation could not have been starker. In aerial combat, small differences in speed, altitude, and strategy often determined life or death, and the Mustang consistently gave American pilots the edge. The psychological dimension cannot be overstated. For the Luftwaffe, encountering the Mustang was akin to facing an enemy that seemed to anticipate every move. German aces, some of whom had survived hundreds of sorties, found themselves struggling against a new kind of adversary. Each encounter with the Mustang chipped away at confidence, eroded morale, and forced pilots into hasty, often costly maneuvers. Unlike earlier fighters that could rely on intimidation, numbers, or legacy, the Mustang demanded respect and adaptability. Its pilots, trained and equipped to exploit its advantages fully, created an environment where German errors were magnified. This shift had cascading effects. As experienced pilots were lost, less experienced replacements faced the daunting challenge of confronting an aircraft that had already proven devastating. The cycle of attrition accelerated, compounding Germany's difficulties in maintaining air superiority. Another element that amplified the Mustang's effectiveness was its versatility. Unlike earlier American fighters, the P-51 could serve multiple roles in a single mission. It could escort bombers, engage enemy fighters, and conduct ground attack operations with equal proficiency. This adaptability meant that a single aircraft type could contribute to multiple layers of operational strategy. Commanders could deploy Mustangs in ways that exploited weaknesses in enemy formations, reinforced offensive campaigns, or provided protective cover where it was most needed. In contrast, many German aircraft were optimized for narrower roles. The Bf-109 excelled in dogfighting but struggled on long-range missions. The Fu-190 could dominate in close combat but lacked the endurance for sustained operations. The Mustang's multi-role capability not only enhanced tactical flexibility but also forced German strategists to constantly reassess their plans, often under pressure and with incomplete information. The contrast between perception and reality played a critical role in the Mustang's psychological impact. German commanders had long underestimated American technological development, assuming that numerical superiority and industrial capacity would compensate for deficiencies in fighter design. The Mustang shattered this illusion. It was a clear example of how innovation, when applied intelligently, could disrupt conventional expectations. The Germans expected attritional battles in which experience and numbers would prevail. Instead, they were confronted with a machine that leveraged superior speed, range, and firepower to achieve decisive results with fewer resources. This disconnect between expectation and reality created confusion, delays in decision-making, and opportunities that the Allies exploited ruthlessly. The Mustang was not just an aircraft, it was a strategic disruptor. Equally significant was the Mustang's role in shaping the larger trajectory of the air war. By enabling sustained, effective bombing campaigns deep within Germany, the Mustang directly contributed to the degradation of German industrial capacity, supply lines, and defensive infrastructure. Factories producing tanks, aircraft, and ammunition were consistently targeted, reducing the Luftwaffe's ability to replace lost aircraft and maintain operational readiness. The psychological impact on German civilians and military planners alike was profound. It became increasingly clear that the Allies had achieved a level of control in the skies that the Luftwaffe could not easily challenge. Each Mustang sortie reinforced the perception of American dominance, a perception that influenced strategic decisions far beyond individual dogfights. In this way, the aircraft served as both a tactical weapon and a symbol of the Allies' growing mastery of the air. The human dimension of the Mustang's impact is as compelling as its technological superiority. Pilots who climbed into the cockpit were not merely operating machines, they were participants in a transformation of aerial warfare. For American pilots, the P-51 represented freedom in the skies, the ability to choose when to engage, where to strike, and how to protect their comrades. This autonomy contrasted sharply with the increasingly desperate Luftwaffe pilots who were often reacting to threats rather than dictating the pace of combat. Veteran German aces, once confident in their tactical mastery, began reporting encounters with Mustangs as harrowing experiences. Letters and diaries from Luftwaffe personnel reveal a sense of shock, disbelief, and growing frustration at an opponent that seemed to anticipate their every maneuver. The psychological effect of facing a fighter that could outpace and outgun them was profound, contributing to a decline in German effectiveness that extended far beyond individual dogfights. The Mustang's influence was not limited to raw air, to air combat. Its presence altered the very planning and execution of missions. Bombing raids that had once required elaborate protective strategies could now be executed with confidence. Commanders could dispatch bombers on deep, penetration missions into the heart of Germany, knowing that P-51 escorts could meet threats far from base. This shift had cascading effects on the Luftwaffe's deployment. German commanders were forced to stretch their already limited resources, dispatching interceptors farther from home to meet the extended reach of Allied bombers. Meanwhile, the Mustang pilots often dictated the timing and location of encounters, selecting favorable engagement zones and using the aircraft's performance to gain the upper hand. The balance of initiative, once firmly in German hands, had shifted decisively to the Americans. The narrative of surprise and disruption is essential to understanding the Mustang's legacy. When the aircraft first appeared, in significant numbers over Europe. German strategists did not fully appreciate the scale of the threat. The Luftwaffe, accustomed to dominating the air with superior training and tactical experience, underestimated the P-51's combination of speed, altitude performance, and firepower. In practical terms, this meant that engagements which the Luftwaffe had expected to be routine became chaotic and costly. Experienced pilots were lost in situations that would have previously favored them, while less experienced flyers struggled to survive against an enemy capable of executing complex maneuvers with confidence. The Mustangs' arrival forced a recalibration of German assumptions, highlighting a broader lesson in military innovation. The element of surprise, when paired with superior technology, can redefine the rules of engagement almost overnight. One of the most vivid examples of the Mustang's effectiveness was its performance during bomber escort missions over Germany in 1944. These missions were notoriously perilous. Allied bombers, laden with high explosives and fuel, were vulnerable to well-coordinated Luftwaffe attacks. Before the Mustang, escort fighters could not accompany bombers deep into enemy territory, leaving aircraft exposed to sustained attacks. Once Mustangs were deployed, however, this vulnerability vanished. German pilots found themselves facing an adversary capable of intercepting and neutralizing threats before bombers were ever in serious danger. The result was both tactical and psychological. Losses among German pilots increased, bomber effectiveness improved, and the perception of American dominance solidified. The Mustang's introduction was more than a technological breakthrough. It represented a shift in the psychological calculus of the war, tilting confidence and morale decisively toward the Allies. The combat performance of the Mustang was enhanced by meticulous pilot training. American flight schools emphasized not only technical proficiency, but also strategic thinking. Pilots were taught to exploit the Mustang's unique characteristics, its superior speed, climbing ability, and firepower, while maintaining situational awareness over extended missions. This approach ensured that encounters with Luftwaffe fighters were not left to chance. Pilots knew how to use altitude, sun positioning, and group tactics to create advantages, often dictating the flow of combat. German pilots, many of whom were increasingly inexperienced due to pilot attrition, struggled to adapt. The contrast in preparation and training became apparent in engagement after engagement, reinforcing the P-51's reputation as an aircraft that could outfight and outthink the opposition. This combination of technology training and strategy exemplifies the broader principles of air warfare. Superior equipment is important, but the ability to leverage it effectively often determines outcomes. The Mustang's impact extended to broader strategic campaigns as well. By enabling more effective bombing raids, it directly contributed to the degradation of German war production. Aircraft factories, munitions plants, and transportation infrastructure were targeted with unprecedented accuracy and consistency. The Luftwaffe, facing mounting pressure from attrition and the constant threat of bombing, struggled to maintain operational readiness. Resources that might have been used to develop new aircraft or improve training were instead diverted to replace losses and patch weaknesses in defensive strategies. In this way, the Mustang played a dual role. It protected Allied forces while simultaneously weakening the enemy's ability to resist. The combination of tactical superiority and strategic impact underscores why the Mustang was more than just a fighter plane. It was a force multiplier in the broader theater of war. Contrast framing highlights the psychological shock experienced by German forces. Prior to the Mustang, the Luftwaffe had relied heavily on numerical superiority and aggressive offensive tactics. Pilots were trained to assume initiative, striking first and using superior maneuverability to dictate outcomes. The Mustang disrupted this framework completely. American pilots, flying long-range missions and employing coordinated tactics, could engage German fighters on terms that were advantageous to them. The Luftwaffe found itself reacting defensively, often in disarray, and suffering significant losses. Reports from German units describe frustration and disbelief as what had once been a predictable air war transformed into a contest in which their assumptions no longer held. The Mustang not only challenged aircraft in the sky, but shattered the very doctrine and mindset that had sustained German aerial dominance for years. The human stories behind these engagements are equally compelling. Veteran Mustang pilots recall encounters in which a single aircraft, properly positioned, could turn the tide of a battle. Bombers once considered vulnerable were defended with precision, and entire Luftwaffe formations were disrupted in minutes. Diaries, letters, and post-war interviews provide vivid accounts of pilots navigating the chaos of dogfights, relying on both training and instinct to exploit the Mustang's strengths. In contrast, German pilots, often younger and less experienced due to wartime attrition, faced overwhelming challenges. The psychological toll of encountering a seemingly superior adversary, combined with the physical stress of high-altitude combat, led to fatigue, mistakes, and in some cases, surrender. These human elements underscore the Mustang's dual impact. It was not only a technical marvel, but also a catalyst for psychological and operational shifts that reverberated across the Luftwaffe. As the war progressed, the P-51 Mustang cemented its reputation as the aircraft that changed the course of the air war over Europe. Its combination of speed, firepower, range, and versatility was unmatched, forcing the Luftwaffe into a defensive posture from which it could not recover. By mid-1944, German pilots were acutely aware that every encounter with a Mustang was a perilous gamble. Even elite aces, who had survived countless battles and accumulated impressive kill counts, found themselves struggling against an aircraft that could outmaneuver, outgun, and outlast them in virtually any engagement. The Mustang's introduction highlighted a critical lesson in warfare. The unexpected combination of innovation and adaptability often proves decisive, rendering traditional advantages irrelevant. It was not just a matter of numbers or experience. It was the strategic and tactical redefinition brought about by a single machine that could achieve multiple objectives simultaneously. The Mustang's influence extended beyond immediate combat outcomes. By ensuring the safety of bomber formations on deep penetration raids, it enabled a sustained campaign against Germany's industrial and logistical infrastructure. Cities like Berlin, Hamburg, and the Ruhr industrial region felt the full weight of Allied air power, and the Luftwaffe's inability to respond effectively accelerated the decline of German war production. Factories that produced aircraft, tanks, and ammunition were repeatedly targeted, disrupting supply chains and preventing the rapid replacement of lost material. The Mustang, therefore, played a pivotal role not just in dogfights but in the broader Allied strategy of crippling Germany's war-making capacity. It exemplified the principle that technological innovation, when paired with strategic insight, can produce outsized effects on the battlefield and beyond. Equally important was the Mustang's symbolic value. For Allied forces, it represented confidence, ingenuity, and the tangible possibility of air superiority. Pilots who flew the Mustang understood the edge they possessed and leveraged it to maximum effect. For the Luftwaffe, by contrast, the Mustang became a source of frustration and fear, a reminder that even their most carefully honed tactics could be rendered obsolete by superior design and innovation. Letters, diaries, and post-war interviews with German pilots repeatedly emphasized the shock of encountering Mustangs, the sense of vulnerability, and the realization that the aircraft had fundamentally altered the rules of engagement. The Mustang was more than a tool. It was a game changer, reshaping both perception and reality in the skies over Europe. Ultimately, the story of the P-51 Mustang is one of innovation, adaptability, and the decisive intersection of technology and strategy. It demonstrates how a single advancement, applied thoughtfully and effectively, can disrupt even the most experienced and confident adversary. By combining long-range capability, speed, maneuverability, and firepower, the Mustang ensured that the Luftwaffe's dominance in Europe could no longer be taken for granted. It protected Allied bombers, demoralized German pilots, and contributed directly to the weakening of Germany's industrial and military infrastructure. Its legacy is not merely in the aircraft themselves, but in the broader lesson it offers that foresight, creativity, and the willingness to challenge assumptions can produce extraordinary outcomes in the most challenging circumstances. The Germans never expected the Mustang. They underestimated the Americans' ability to innovate and adapt to the challenges of high-stakes aerial warfare. And when the Mustangs arrived, they confronted a reality that had shifted beneath their feet, one where their experience, tactics, and confidence were no longer enough. The skies of Europe became a proving ground for a new kind of air power, one that combined technology, strategy, and human skill in perfect alignment. It was a transformation that changed the course of the war, reshaping the balance of power in the air and ensuring that the Allies could carry the fight deep into German territory with confidence and effectiveness. The Mustang was not just an aircraft, it was the embodiment of a principle that resonates far beyond the context of World War II's the unexpected. Well-executed innovation can redefine the battlefield and determine the fate of nations.